All right, today we're going to talk about different kinds of racism. And to start with, I'm going to start with my disclaimer that I got up here, because racism can be a controversial topic, especially when we start talking about systemic racism. So, racism, it's a big topic. This lesson, it's a short lesson, and it reflects my understanding. We're not going to cover everything that there is to say. Um, I'm not an expert. I am a middle school teacher, and I just hope you keep an open mind and hopefully you walk away learning a couple things. And I want, hopefully, for my eighth graders to be a more informed teenager than I was about some of these things. So, with my first learning goal in mind, I want you to understand how current issues connect to our civil rights era, and think about, is our civil rights era really over? So that's something that we learn about the civil rights era as a very isolated kind of incident. We're like, all right, and then it ended in 1968 when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and then everyone lived happily ever after. Maybe not. So yeah, think about the continuation of our civil rights situation. Want to recognize different ways we see racism in history, society, and ourselves. And with the second and third one kind of together, be aware of how systemic type problems to be a more informed citizen and how these systemic type things kind of influence us. So we're going to start with explicit racism. So I got a definition here, which we already know what racism is. It's prejudice, bigotry, discrimination based on race and cultural superiority, and it is usually oppressing another group. So why are people racist? Well, because culture. So this is how this goes. So we got a happy little family here, and so the life experience and community of parents is going to directly influence and shape the way of thinking for future generations. This is not a new concept. This is just how life works. We are the product of our parents and our community. If our community happens to be a racist and oppressive one, then future generations are going to continue to perpetuate and believe negative images and associations of an oppressed group of people. So in our civil rights era in the 50s and the 60s, and before that, even after slavery is over, we get our Jim Crow, we get segregation. These are explicitly racist practices. And still today, we might still see some people kind of explicitly being obviously racist. So generally speaking, neo-Nazis, the Nazi flag, doing a Zig Heil is typically understood to be pretty obviously explicit racism. And so this is just whenever anybody says or does anything to target a racial group with the intention to be harmful and perpetuate oppression. If you're saying something intentionally to be mean and hurtful about a racial group, that would be obvious racism. I want to talk about unconscious bias too. I'm not calling it racism, but sometimes we have this unconscious bias and it might skew a little racist sometimes. So let's back it up. Everybody has bias, and bias just means favor for or against something. And our unconscious bias, so something that we don't think about, it's just something that occurs naturally, it is uncontrollable. It's like an instinct, and our instincts are based on our community and culture, our personal lived experience, and other parts of our reality. So I got another little diagram here. I chose to use a gender neutral symbol to represent all of us. And if the concept of a gender neutral symbol by itself is triggering you like, oh, well, I feel uncomfortable suddenly, that is your unconscious bias speaking to you. So in our culture, we have stereotypes, and our bias might be based on stereotypes. This lesson is not about stereotypes, but generally speaking, we know what a stereotype is. It's a generally widely held belief about some kind of group of people. And our stereotypes in our mind might be reinforced by the media and the things that we see in our lives on TV, music, and pop culture, and whatnot. We also might have an individual lived experience with a person of a group that we know has a stereotype. And sometimes the stereotype we have influences our individual interaction with someone, and then that interaction can then again still reinforce sometimes that stereotype. And this cycle perpetuates itself, like constantly. And it's something that it happens unconsciously. There's another part of our reality that it might be a new concept that I want to introduce systemic racism. And systemic racism, again, might be a little bit triggering, so I'm going to try to break it down. It's a circumstance of systems or laws that disproportionately negatively affects people of color. And so these things all are affecting us unconsciously at all time, and we get this unconscious bias. And our unconscious bias, it just happens. Acts of racism can happen when we don't check or question or really think deeply about our own thinking, about our own unconscious thoughts sometimes. Or racism also happens when somebody, explicitly chooses to be like, you know what, we're going to say something racist. Then obviously explicit racism happens. We're going to try to come back to that image at the end. But I want to make the distinction between explicit racism and like this unconscious bias that happens because we know what explicit racism is. I don't have to sell you on that idea. That's what the whole last lesson was about through the whole civil rights era. We know examples of obvious, explicit, racist people and actions. But there is still some unconscious things going on. And there are this idea of systemic racism. So I'm going to start with some easy ones. There's different racist systems. There's a bunch of them. And we're going to start with some obviously explicitly racist ones. So obviously explicitly racist systems like slavery. So no one is going to say that slavery was not racist or not oppressive because it for sure was. Jim Crow laws after slavery is over. So slavery was over. So again, the whole undermining and trying to still be oppressive Jim Crow laws, that's what they were there to do, along with segregation. So these are obviously explicitly racist systems put in place by racist people with the express purpose of oppressing another group of people. Another maybe lesser known oppressive or racist system was housing and loan discrimination. So in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, especially the 50s, remember when we learned about the American dream in the 50s and people come home from the war and the economy was great and everybody starts moving out to the suburbs. And I give you some statistic that was like, by 1960, like a third of Americans were living in a suburb and it was great, it was beautiful, and everyone was happy, unless you were black. And obviously, too, there was a lot of poor white people, too, but it's not about them right now. So black families were denied home loans through a process called redlining. This lesson is also not about redlining. We're not going to get into that. But it was a system and practice that prevented black families from getting a loan so they could not move into the suburbs. And even if they were a wealthy black family, or they had enough money, or they could get that loan somehow, if they tried to move to a suburb, they were just excluded from just good old regular explicit racism, like, oh, you're black, I see. You're not going to live here then. This is not for you. So Levittown, remember that was like one of our first big suburbs. This is their actual racial exclusion clause. The tenant agrees not to permit the premises to be used or occupied by any person other than members of the Caucasian race. But the employment and maintenance of other than Caucasian domestic servants shall be permitted. I admit the grammar on that's a little bit But this policy, this racial exclusion policy, was put in place in suburbs all across the country outside of these cities. So this is explicit racist systems and laws that existed. This is like kind of indisputable. So I want to rebrand this idea of systemic racism to as what I'm calling persistent systemic racism. And this is something that I made up. So you're not going to find this anywhere that anybody else has written about, at least that as far as I know. Because this idea of systemic racism, again, it's kind of controversial and people maybe don't agree with it. And so I want to present it in a different way maybe than maybe some people have heard about it before. So some systems might be unintentional, but are continuing effects even after an explicit racist system has stopped. And so the one that I want to talk about is generational wealth and the racial wealth gap. So the idea of generational wealth is that it's the wealth or accumulation of resources and money and assets that a family generates and accumulates and passes on to its future generations. So like in a family, I am the direct beneficiary of my parents and my grandparents and my great grandparents and so on. So that makes sense. The racial wealth gap is just the difference on average between people of color and non people of color, mostly white in this case, and especially black. So the gap between, on average, white and black is vast and has been and will continue. And one of those reasons is because real estate historically has been a good investment for people. So we learned about investments when we learned about the stock market and investing. And land investment was one of those things that usually went up in value. And so land ownership and possession, and then passing through your family for generations, is one of the ways that families like got generational wealth, is through their investments in real estate. Black families have been excluded from this practice up until 1968, which outlawed those housing discrimination laws that I just told you about. And so also to remember, though, that our pattern of society kind of resisting laws, and then it's got to take time to catch up to the new law. So even though it was outlawed in 1968, do you think that everyone was just like, okay, cool, now that it's not legal, we will stop being racist and discriminating? Probably not. So the idea of generational wealth and this wealth gap, it's not a law. There's no law that says black families are not allowed to inherit their family's wealth. It just happens, though. Black families are unable to inherit their family's wealth because there is no wealth to inherit. Now, again, I'm generalizing and oversimplifying, and of course, there are outliers to this case. But this system is a circumstance left over after 200 plus years of explicitly racist systems. So we're going to look at some stats and some graphs. You know, I love some stats and some graphs. And I want to remind everybody here that my claim is just that the circumstance of the racial wealth gap is at least in part due to a lack of ability to accumulate generational wealth, which is a result of explicitly racist systems. So I found this stat too. This is according to the National Association of Realtors, and I found this in 2 different sources. The percentages were a little bit different, but everything that I looked at pointed to about this. Homeownership in recently is between 2016 and 2020 is around 41% for black people and around 71% for whites. The next one was I think they still use Hispanic or Latino people, and I think theirs is around like 49%. And this also kind of reflects that too. So this is just our poverty rates. So you can pause, you can take a look at some of these graphs. I've showed you this one before. So we've got about 20% poverty rate for our African Americans around 2000. And of course, again, there are still poor white people. They're still everywhere. But again, it's that disproportionately affecting and negatively affecting people of color. So this is median household incomes. So this is showing you on average what an average black family is earning. And again, it's median, so it's average, which means there are people above and there are people below. But you can still see consistently that black families have been earning less since, as far as this graph was keeping track, in 1965. So if you think about this another way too, if you imagine a timeline, and it might help you conceptualize the historical barriers of explicitly racist systems that prevented the generational wealth accumulation and leaves us with this persistent system of racial inequality. So if you imagine in 2020 and a family's ability to accumulate wealth stopped here, and that's at best if they were be able to be a homeowner then. And so our explicitly racist systems at play, you've got Jim Crow and housing discrimination, and then obviously before that slavery. So a family's ability to do this is hindered and stopped within the last 80 years. This graph is really interesting, and you can pause it and take a look at it or ask me questions about it later, but I'm going to skip over it for now because I want to get back to this little bit. So there's systems at play that are happening in the background of our lives that we don't necessarily even think about. And all that I want you to do is just be aware of these things. Be aware that there are these kind of not obvious and explicit systems that are influencing how we think and see the world.